Hello and welcome to this webinar hosted by Lynda Grattan and Andrew Scott from the London Business School on their new book, The New Long Life, A Framework for Flourishing in a Changing World. I hold a copy here, it's just out. I myself am Eric Vinkier, I'm an MBA 2000, and I have the particular pleasure of welcoming also the alumni from classes like myself, ending the year on a 0 or a 5, for whom it's now the virtual reunion. But also welcome to other attendants. This is an open webinar to all sorts of attendants. So people are joining us from across the world, and we're here to hear this talk from two London Business School legends. Lynda is Professor of Management Practice at the London Business School. As you probably know, she directs the program Human Resource Strategy and Transforming Companies, one of the world's leading programs on human resources. She teaches an elective on the future of work, which is an outgrowth of the Future of Work Consortium, where she works with more than 60 companies worldwide on understanding the future of HR. She has also been awarded the Excellence of Teaching Award for this course in 2016. Andrew is a professor of economics. I myself had macroeconomics from Andrew many years ago, 22 years ago. I think he was formerly Deputy Dean of the Business School, and he is a research fellow or research associates of very many. I'm not sure I will even read off all of the affiliations that he has, but the UK's Office for Budget Responsibility, where he is an advisor, the Honours Committee on Science and Technology of the Cabinet Office, the Longevity Forum, which he co-founded. He's also a member of the UK's Longevity Council and a World Economic Forum Council on Japan. Finally, Stanford University Center on Longevity has him as a scholar. They will be talking today about this second book called The New Long Life, Framework for Flourishing in a Changing World. It's out just a few days. The book considers how the challenges and opportunities of social and technological ingenuity shape a new age of longer lives, considering how this can also be applied to worlds stricken by COVID-19. I will hand over first to Lynda. Lynda Grattan, please.
Thank you, Eric. And first of all, welcome. How marvelous to see you all here. Even though I'm staring into a little green button, I feel as if you are in front of me. So if you were taught by me or Andrew, please put your hand up and wave your hand, and we'll be able to see you from across the world. We're absolutely thrilled to be bringing to you today our new book, The New Long Life. You probably remember that Andrew and I wrote, this is not our first book, this is actually our second book together. We wrote The 100-Year Life a couple of years ago together. I think it must have been about 6 or 7 years. And what we realized there is that when you think about the future, there are these incredibly important trends that are shifting the way that we live and the way that we work. And we look there specifically at what happens when everyone lives to 100. And that was a very important book. It went, we've sold almost 1 million copies. It became the best-selling book in Japan, translated into many languages. And as Andrew and I were moving around the world, talking to people about that book and how they were thinking about the future, they really talked a great deal, not just about longevity, but also about, what happens when technology changes what we do. Will I still have a job? What will machines do? But also some issues around families. We know from London Business School that many of you are in dual careers. How's that going to play out? So that was really what the book was about. And in it, we have a real opportunity to address some important issues. Now, of course, publishing in the middle of a pandemic might seem like a rather foolish thing to do, but actually the truth is that the book turns out to be a perfect pandemic read, because it's about the future, it's about how we build resilience, and it's really about what we all have to do, including corporations, governments, and education institutions, to get this right. But let me hand over now to Andrew to say a bit more about just how we framed the big issues that are facing us right now.
Thank you, Lynda, and also just echo how nice it is to be here with you. I think that's the right word. It's an irony because, of course, one of the things the book is about is how we try and create a community while using these new things like the technology we're utilizing now. So I wish we were here together, but I'm very glad that we can do this virtually. And, you know, Lynda talked about the motivation behind the book, and there's just different things. What we tend to focus on is look where there's attention, think about what the problem is, and then sort of think about how we can make things better and try and be optimistic about it. And, you know, we started writing this book 3-4 years ago, I guess, and a year after the 100-Year Life came out. And really, you know, I guess our starting point was things don't feel right. And I don't think they've got any better in the 3 or 4 years since we were writing. And of course, right now we're seeing an awful lot of social tensions and economic tensions, not all of them caused by COVID. COVID has in many ways accelerated those trends. And, you know, the notion of business as usual, whether it's your individual life or a company, just doesn't seem appropriate. And, you know, COVID, in business schools, we talk a lot about disruption, but COVID, I think, has truly shown us the meaning of the word disruption. I'm a big fan of history. Historians like to sort of bookend periods with dates. And I think 2007-8 marked the end of a sustained period of global growth based on a particular model. We had a financial crisis, and the 10-12 years since then have not been great. They've been revealing some of the political and social problems of the past. And I do think historians will choose 2020 and COVID as the beginning of a new period. I hate to use the phrase new normal, but it does feel like something is beginning to change. And so the question then is, well, if things are going to change, what should they change to? What is that future? And the book focuses upon two things which COVID has absolutely brought to the fore. How do we combine work and life in a world using these modern technologies, and who can benefit from it? And secondly, how do we create a healthy economy and a healthy society, a healthy population when we have so many older people in an aging society? And what I think is striking is how dystopian most of the discussion is around an aging society and around AI and robotics. You know, robots are going to take over the world. We're all going to lose our jobs. We can't afford to get old. Old people are a big problem and a big burden. And I understand entirely why people have those fears. But I think there's also something else here. We've got this wonderful, smart new technology. We're living longer lives, and on average, they're healthier lives for longer. And that should be something we can seize an opportunity. And for us, one of the problems with this dystopian viewpoint is things are put rather impersonally. It's about the robots. It's about the old. But of course, these things are going to affect us all in very intimate, individual ways. It's going to affect how we live, our relationships, who we work with, how we structure our career. And so we've got to think about that at an individual level, but also at a social level. And in particular, we've got to understand that technology and demography are not destiny. These are not impersonal aggregate forces that we cannot shape. And in the book, we talk about human ingenuity, and human ingenuity has come up with these great inventions, wonderful machines, AI and robotics. It's come up with the ability to add years to life. But what we sort of need now is some social ingenuity to make those things work for us. And so what the book tries to focus on is really three things. A, how do we prepare? B, what do we want? And three, what do we need to support us to achieve that? And we look at that both at the individual level, but crucially also the social level, because these are big, big forces that require social change. And I guess the sort of four key assumptions underlying the book. The first is that this is a really important narrative for us as a society. This is not an agenda we can leave to governments and Lord knows firms. It needs to be us who says, this is what we want. We can't leave Google, etc., to tell us how to use AI in our lives. Two, there are opportunities to be seized. As I said, if we are living longer, healthier lives, that should be a great achievement. How we can sort of turn one of the greatest achievements of the 20th century, that more people are living longer, into a sort of a nightmare scenario. Well, that's a massive problem. That seems wrong. And, you know, one of the things we focus on in the book is if machines are going to become better at being machines, how do we seize the opportunities of longer life and smarter technology to make us more human? There's a great quote by Kasparov who says, you know, AI will change every aspect of our daily lives, but it won't change us as humans. It will just enable us to reveal our nature as humans. I think that's what we're kind of fighting for. Then I think, and all the more so, I think right now, you know, this is an urgent task. It's not too late. We can do something, but we need to start that debate. We need to prepare ourselves individually and start a social narrative. And then the other thing, and I say this as an economist, because most economists would tell you is the most valuable things to us as humans aren't included in GDP. And that's been patently obvious through COVID, where we have decided to crater the economy in order to save lives. So we've revealed during this time what really matters to us. And I think that perspective is one we have to take going forward. So I'm just going to say a little bit more about the trends, and there's more in the book, but you probably heard a lot about, not just from us, but from others, about how AI and robotics and demography are changing things. So let's just focus a little bit upon AI. And there's a whole cluster of technological developments, and Moore's law is the one that tends to get the biggest focus, although ironically, that's the one that tends to be slowing down right now. But for me personally, I don't think we're about to have super intelligence or singularity anytime soon. I don't think humans are going to become redundant. But what is clear is the labour market is going to be transformed in terms of jobs, skills, careers, and what you need to do. And so that's something we're going to have to deal with. Now, there's loads of numbers I could bludgeon you with here. One of my favourite ones is that when Pew do a survey of experts, 52% of them think technology will create mass unemployment, 48% think it doesn't. So there's just massive disagreement here. Now, what you can see happening in the labour market is displacement. We can always see the jobs that are going to be automated. It's always very hard to see the jobs that will be created, but basically what we're seeing in the labour market is a shift where routine jobs are being done by automation. And that's whether they are cognitive jobs like sort of accounts, finance, marketing, etc., where big data now becomes the decision maker, or whether it's manual tasks. So we're going to start to see a much greater shift towards non-routine tasks. And they're the things that are going to celebrate human skills much more. I know Lynda will talk more, but by human skills, I mean creativity, decision-making under ambiguity, but also empathy and just caring for people. Now, there's a big debate about how many jobs will be destroyed by automation, and there's all sorts of estimates. 14% is what the OECD say, jobs are at threat from being lost from automation. But actually, I think it's a mistake to just focus on that 14%, because there's 86% of people who that says won't lose their jobs, but there'll be 100% anxiety from everyone that they might lose their jobs. And also that 86% will not carry on doing the job in the same way they're doing now. Even if they still find their job carries on, they will be doing it using different skills and different technology and in different ways. So this is a much more richer impact than just focusing on those who will lose their jobs. But of course, what that says is we're going to see a lot of churn in the labour market. We're going to see shifts in what skills are important. And the other thing is that the labour market is increasingly defined over tasks rather than jobs. And that's going to be a very big impact on your career, because at certain points in time, you might have a job. At other time, you might be providing through the gig economy or freelance particular tasks. And with that comes a big shift of individual responsibility onto you. Now, older people, there's two things happening here. One is just more older people. The number of people globally aged over 65 is currently 1 in 12. It's going to be 1 in 6 by 2050. Japan in 2050, 1 in 5 people will be over 80. So there's a lot more old people, but we tend to flip it the other way around and say, well, forget about the mixture between young and old. Think about your lifespan, and your lifespan's got longer. So 100 years ago, if you were 20, you had a 50% chance of making it to 70. Someone today has a 90% chance. So life has got a lot longer. You've got more future ahead of you. One of the stats I love is the average Brit has never been so old, but never had so long left to live. And that requires a different way of thinking about age and a different way of thinking about the future. Now, with that too comes the possibility of what we call a longevity dividend. If people are living longer and on average are healthier for longer, that should be good news for the economy. So how can we bring that about? Now, I try to set the scene a little bit about the motivation for the book, a brief overview about technology and longevity. I'm going to hand over to Lynda in a minute after we do our first poll. But I would love, Tanya, if you could load up the first poll. And I want to get your opinions on what you think about this future, this utopian or dystopian mix. You can put multiple answers in here. You don't have to be restricted to just one. But as you think about the future, what do you think is most likely? More flexible ways of working, a world of mass unemployment, longer careers and healthier lives, massive government finance problems because of pension and an aging society, huge increases in inequality, or a more human world. So this is our baseline to sort of see what type of audience we've got, and perhaps a little bit just how your day's going as well. But if we can get your answers to this, and Tanya, when we're ready, we can show them. More flexible ways of working, right? That's the theme of COVID, isn't it, as well? So we've got a nice long mix of different answers here. And I'm glad that by and large, you're kind of positive. I think more flexible working overall is a positive. The longer careers and healthier, longer lives, I think, is a good thing. A purpose is important. But inequality has picked up an awful lot. The government finances are a problem. And we've got to try and work a bit at that more human world, because surely that's what human progress is about, making our world more human. Now, I'm just going to hand over to Lynda in a second, but just try and sort of do the segue from what I've been talking about to what Lynda's coming in about, because, you know, there's a lot about economics, and clearly securing economic prosperity is absolutely crucial. If people aren't getting the benefits of economic growth, we have massive political problems. But we know that there's something else in this world here. And I think it's kind of about identity. And, you know, what we're painting is a picture with these longer lives, these multiple stages, technology changing the skills. And the danger is it becomes fragmented in terms of your individual life and fragmented as a society. So how do we weave together a sense of identity, create a sense of purpose in this sort of pluralistic, fragmented world? And how do we harness that as humans? And that's how I want to hand over to Lynda, who will try and explain the framework that we have around that.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. You know, the marvelous thing about Andrew and I working together, and we are on our second book, so you can see we're having a lot of fun there, is that Andrew, as you know, is an economist. I'm a psychologist. And so this question of how would we frame this, you know, how would we actually create a way for you to think about how you would deal with that, was a very important part of the work that we did together. I'm going to suggest that you frame it in three ways. The first is around narrate, and by which I mean, what's the story I'm telling about my own life? Secondly, around explore, particularly in view of what Andrew has talked about with regard to some of the real challenges in terms of technology changing the way that we work. And the third is about relate, which is to say, you know, how do we relate to each other in terms of our families, but also how do we relate to our communities and indeed to the generations that we have around us. So let me say a little bit about each one of those things. I mean, those of you who have been to my elective on the future of work, and we can have a show of hands there. Hi, everybody who's been on my elective. You remember that one of the things that we did in that elective, on the final day actually of the elective, is I asked you to think about possible selves. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that, you know, we all know something about our past. We might have an analyst to help us really understand it better, but we have an idea about our past, and we sort of know where we are now in terms of the platform that we have available to us in terms of our skills, in terms of our networks and so on. But actually what we're saying is that as we look forward, we have a number of pathways that we can take. We call these possible selves. And one of the interesting things about what Andrew was talking about earlier, which is we're living longer, is that means that we have more choice. It means we have more possible lives, and it means that we can switch and optimize right the way through it. And we talk about that quite a lot in the book. And one of the things that we're saying is, rather than take, when you think about time, imagining that you're on a hilltop where the most important thing is the time you're at now, and the past is less important and the future is less important, we're suggesting that you, as it were, rise into the air and look down, take a bird's eye perspective of time. And that allows you to really think about how you explore those possible selves for the future, but also what sort of investments you want to take to them. You know, one of the questions we ask is, you know, what would your 80-year-old self say to you now about where you are now? So this exploration of my narrative, you know, what's the story of my life, is very important, because as Andrew said earlier, you know, we have the opportunity to build the society we want. And in fact, actually, COVID has made that even more important. And we have the opportunity to live the life that we want. So narrate is going to be really important. The second area is what we call explore. Now, at the heart of exploration are two important facts that Andrew spoke about. First is we're going to live longer. And you know, from those of you who read The 100-Year Life, the great news about living longer is that you work longer. And I think we should all be imagining that we will be engaged in some sort of productive employment up into our 70s. Now, that's sort of good news in a way, because we're going to live longer healthily. But the bad news is, you know, my God, how am I going to do that right the way through my life with no breaks? Well, that's why we think the second aspect of our framework, which is explore, is so important. Because clearly, as we think about our possible selves, we can't possibly stay on the same path. But to switch paths, to change, to transform ourselves, we have to explore who we are. We have to build new ways of thinking. We have to build new skill sets. And to do that, we need to build more diverse networks. But the second thing that Andrew talked about, which is very important in terms of explore, is this question of technology and jobs. As he mentioned, the truth is that there are very few jobs that are going to be completely destroyed by technology. But for all of us, for most of us, a proportion of our current and future job will be automated. And some people are saying, you know, 40, 50, 60% of the jobs we do will be automated. Well, where does that leave us in terms of our resilience? Well, either we need to upskill, i.e. to move to those parts of the job which aren't going to be automated, and those tend to be more human aspects, both in terms of emotional human aspects, empathy, understanding, but also cognitive human aspects, such as hypothesis creating, you know, really intense decision-making systems thinking and so on. So we have to, right the way through our life, be prepared to upskill, but we also need to think about reskilling. My imagination is that none of us are going to do the same thing right the way through our life. And in fact, when I asked you in my elective to talk about your possible selves, most of you thought that you would have more than one career. And to do that, you have to reskill. And that means you have to be prepared to come back to London Business School, and we will welcome you back, or indeed prepared to really spend time in educating yourself right the way through your life. So that's going to be really important. But I wanted to finish on this third aspect of the framework, which is to do with relationships. Now, it's really important, I think, that so many of you, when you thought about the future, said, I want to work more flexibly. Now, why do you want to work more flexibly? And this, by the way, the pandemic has been an extraordinary acceleration, because my guess is one of the reasons you want to work more flexibly is you've spent more time at home. And for those of you who've got kids, you've spent more time with your children. Now, I have for years, and those of you who read my work know this, have said we need to think about the way that families work and the way that communities work. This gives us a real opportunity to do that. As we live longer, as we marry later, as we have fewer children, we can really focus much more on building up our relationships within our family. And I suspect that many of you who are parents are saying, I want to spend more time with my kids. You know, in a short life, you don't have, you have to sort of rush through it. But in a long life, you have a great deal of time left available to you. You have all that gift of extra time. Why not take some of that time that you used to think was about retirement and reallocate it to things that we believe will be crucial in terms of a framework for a new way of living. And that's to do with reallocating it into your relationships, into your friendships, into your family, and indeed into your community. You know, I'm sure all around the world, we've been at least once a week in the UK, and I know in some countries much more often, saying thank you to members of our community. Both Andrew and I have got kids who are medical doctors, so we are very close to those members of our community who have absolutely stepped up and we've become so much closer to our neighborhood. You know, how do we keep some of that way that we've now learned to live? How do we keep that going after this pandemic is over? So as we think about the sort of framing we want for our new long life, we think that narration, you know, telling the story of our life, which is not going to be the same as our grandparents or our great-grandparents, is going to be our story. Exploring and learning right the way through our life, not just at the beginning of our life, and indeed relating to our friends, to our family, to our community, is going to play a really important part of that. And to help us to think a bit more about just how we value that, can I now look at poll 2, please? And poll 2 is asking you about flourishing and what action is your top priority? So exploring your possible selves, taking a long-term perspective on time, engaging in a lifetime of learning, creating a multi-stage life, spending more time with your family, developing closer links with your community. What are some of the things that you believe to be absolutely crucial in terms of the actions that you want to take over the next couple of years? By the way, I can see lots of chat going on. Please do chat, because that will help Eric think about the questions. So do at this stage also think about questions, because we're going to be opening up for questions in about 15 minutes time. So let's take a look at this second poll. Okay, first thing is, we're very diverse. That's great news, isn't it? Just as you would expect of London Business School alumni, you want to engage in a lifetime of learning. Please, we're delighted to hear that. And Andrew and I are always there, available to help you to do that. Creating a multi-stage life is really your #1 priority right now. Only 10% of you want to spend more time with your family. I guess that when you've just spent 3 months with children over the age of 10, maybe that's not a big priority for you right now. And actually quite a lot of you want to explore your possible self. So when you think about the framing, narrate, explore, relate, it sounds to me that it's the narration and the exploring that are things that are real priorities for you right now. So thank you so much for that poll. We're going to start talking now about the final part of the book, which is about what is it that institutions should do. And we look at 3 types of institutions. We look at corporations, we look at education, and we look at government. I'm going to say something about what we think corporations should do, and then I'm going to hand over to Andrew to talk about what we see governments and education doing. So let me briefly say something about what corporations can do. You know, for many of you, corporations, the organizations that you work with, provide the context of much of your life. In fact, of course, what we've learned from the pandemic is that the boundaries between work and home have begun to break down. And some of us have realized those boundaries are really important, but at the same time, we've also thought again about our relationship to our corporate, to the organization. And of course, many of us on the webinar have managerial and leadership positions. So what would we say you should be thinking about in terms of helping both yourself as leaders, but indeed your employees think about the new long life? Well, I'm going to make 4 suggestions about that. #1, as you said in your own poll 2, think about a multi-stage life. So you've already heard that the hundreds of people on this webinar are saying, I want a multi-stage life. We need to listen to that. And by multi-stage, I mean, we need to allow people to come into the organization and out of the organization in a much more flexible way. You know, quite a number of you, particularly those of you working, for example, in Japanese companies, are finding that either you jump in as a graduate or you can't get in at all. And similarly, when you move out, maybe to spend a year you know, exploring, traveling the world, learning a new language, going to London Business School, you can't then get back in again. So #1 priority for corporations is make sure that you hear the voices of the people we've just listened to and really think about a multi-stage life. Secondly, support healthy families. You know, one of the things that comes out very clearly in our work is that families are really important to our mental health and also to our physical health. We need to spend time with our families. We need to spend time on our own physical health. Make sure that you give a priority to that. And that means supporting parents. You already do something to support mothers who work. We need to do more to support fathers. You know, it's an incredible discrimination that mums get so much support than fathers do when it comes to maternity versus paternity leave. We need to help fathers become the sort of parents they want to be. Number 3, and this again came out in our poll just then, really think about lifelong learning, really see that investing in people's learning capability right the way through their life is going to be absolutely crucial to them. And finally, ditch ageism. And we can also say that ditch stereotypes of age. Andrew and I do not like the term baby boomers or Gen X or Gen Y or snowflakes or any of those things. And that's because there's no empirical evidence that suggests that just because you were born in one year, you're completely similar to everybody else who was born in that same year. And secondly, completely different than the person who was born 5 years later. And that sort of stereotypical notion of age is very damaging. And we would very much like corporations to stop doing that and also ditch ageism. Right now, it's very difficult to get a job in a corporation if you're age over 60. There's lots of research to show that. That's a big mistake because people over the age of 60 have much to bring in terms of wisdom, experience. You know, if you want, anybody who's working through a pandemic right now will be very, very pleased to have working around them people who went through the last major recession because they have experience of how to deal with that. So let's make the 4th thing, ditching ageism. I want to hand over to Andrew now, who's going to say a bit more about these institutional issues.
It was interesting, as Lynda pointed out, how many of you put lifelong learning as a priority. And, you know, one of the things we need to support us in adapting to this new long life is a change in our education system. So much of what we talk about in the book is saying we need to update the institutions that were put in place in the Industrial Revolution. You know, the notion of work and home, of fixed hours, even the gender role in terms of caring and careers, so much that is a legacy of the Industrial Revolution, and so too is our education system. Now, economists talk about a race between education and technology, and as technology advances, education has to keep up, or else you don't fare very well. And given how technology is about to shoot ahead, clearly we need to do more education. With the Industrial Revolution, we did that. We did something brilliant. We gave everyone an education up to 12, 14, 16, and now 18. And obviously, many go beyond. I think 50% go beyond in the UK now. So in terms of that race, wow, we need to do more education. But of course, if you then think about that, so we're going to do more education, but front loading at the beginning doesn't seem right, given the technological change that's going to occur and those longer careers. So it's going to have to be more spread out. And again, one of the things we focus on is how longevity changes everything, not just the end of life. And so if you know you're going to do more education later in life, then you need to do things differently at the beginning. And almost learning to learn is going to be one of the key skills early on. And, you know, interesting, I did like the answer in the second poll, Lynda, where about 14% of people said, I want to learn that longer term perspective. And that's something we really have to get used to, because that's going to be a key human skill, that long-term perspective. Because if we've got more future, we need to invest in it more. And how we inculcate that from a young age, I think, is going to be really key, because those people who do take a long-term perspective are going to do really well with these longer lives. If you haven't, then you're going to see this widening inequality occur. But of course, what you also need to have is a focus on human skills, the skills we talked about earlier. Because if machines get better and better at being machine-like, yes, there'll be a need for people to understand the machines, to explain the machines, to maintain the machines, but it's going to be really the human skills of creativity, hypothesis testing, caring, empathy, the things that are really going to be important. And by the way, that's to me a little bit encouraging in terms of inequality, because normally, it's technical skills that you need to keep ahead of technology. But this technology is going to replace a lot of people with technical skills. I'm an academic, and I know that sort of technical skills and human skills don't always come together very well. And that skill of empathy is, I think, distributed with education in a very different way from technical skills. But what we need from our education system, it's very front-loaded right now. And so we're going to have to do a much greater focus on adult education. A stat I always give is a conversation with Hunt Lambert, who used to be the Dean of Continuing Education at Harvard. And he said last year, Harvard's continuing education admitted more students than the rest of Harvard put together. That's the kind of that reversal that's going to have to happen in the education system. And this lifelong stuff is important. Like, education's got to become a bit more like health. So in the book, we sort of say, if I said to you, how's your health? And you said I ran a marathon 20 years ago, you'd say, well, that's not a very good informative answer. But if we say, what's your education? You say, well, I did a degree 20 years ago in economics or 30 years ago in economics. We take that as an answer. But education and health, they're both going to be key to surviving this new long life. And they're going to have to be updated all the time. So that means we need to have a much more flexible and navigable system. The notion of graduating, if you're doing lifelong learning, starts to become a bit weird. You never properly finish, which I think also raises the possibility that you might have less education early on, just enough to get you that first role, and then you'll come back later. So that's what we mean by that navigable and flexible structure. All sorts of age restrictions are in place in society reflecting a past life, but education is one which is very, very restrictive around age. So, applying for undergraduates if you're over 20 years of age is a tough thing to do. So we're going to get much more blending of the age groups. We're going to see education which is much less focused on degrees and much more focused on short skills that provide job prospects. But it won't all be about skills. We're also going to see the need for midlife transitions. One of the great things for me of going to university at age 18 was going with a certain viewpoint, a certain background, and then mixing with all these different people, reforming your values, and then saying, this is what I'm going to do with my life. But by the time you hit 50, I think you probably need another dose of that. I certainly did. So, how do we create those transitional communities that help us not just to learn, but also to refresh our values and our sense of purpose and identity? The other thing, and by the way, this is going to be happening not just within universities and schools. We are seeing an explosion of apps, private sector companies, all providing this short, stackable, flexible, skill-based approach to education. And that's important because it also needs to be inclusive. Because if the future is about upgrading your skills, we've got to make sure that just as we did with education and Industrial Revolution, we provide it at scale to everyone. And that's a real challenge. If you look at the data around adult education, it's mostly done by the people who already have got lots of education. So your thirst for further learning is great, but you're not a typical group. You've already got a lot of education. So how do we roll that out? And to me, that is absolutely crucial, because the other thing about education, it's not just about skills and jobs and identity. It's also about being a citizen and feeling you can participate properly in society. Which brings me on to the sort of what we need from governments. And governments have a crucial role here, absolutely crucial role, because this is not something we expect firms to do on their own or individuals. Governments have to drive things. And one of the really big feedback from your poll was that concern around inequality. And we have a lot about it, tackling inequality in the book. If you look at the Industrial Revolution, the first half of the Industrial Revolution was driven by firms and automation, and it didn't really work out well for people. Wages fell, cities were bad places to live. And then you saw a labor movement that started to push for better working conditions and higher wages. And the automation that happened in the second half of the Industrial Revolution brought about much more broad-based prosperity. Similarly, before the Second World War, there was a lot of monopoly power, firms and governments were driving the agenda. But after the Second World War, there was a need to recognize all of society and make growth inclusive, to make sure everyone gets some benefits from it. And we've really got to make sure that that happens this time. So how do we do that? Well, I think in the employment world, there's two key things governments need to do. One is to make sure they're creating the skills that people need to get the jobs of the future. But also they need to focus on making sure that we create jobs for the existing skills of people, because not everyone's going to be able to retrain and become a full stack developer. So we've got to start thinking too, not just about sort of the high-tech superstar firms, but some of the small-scale firms that provide local services. And that's going to be incredibly important post-COVID, where that's going to be the type of jobs that we need. So two things: creating skills for jobs and creating jobs for skills. Critically, we have to make sure that we use tech not just to automate things, but to augment people. At the moment, I'm really worried that post-COVID, we'll see firms using bad quality tech because it's cheap and they can get rid of workers. We've got to make sure that firms don't have a tax advantage to invest in capital, but they've also got a tax advantage to invest in augmenting the productivity of a worker. We need augmentation, not automation. I think, and this is kind of heresy perhaps for an economist, that means also we need to move away from focusing on GDP. GDP is a great measure of prosperity in terms of economic resources when times are stable. But when you're going through periods of transition and anxiety, whether that be COVID or with technology and longer lives, you need much broader measures of welfare. And then critically, we need a government that can unleash a longevity dividend. One that focuses on preventative health, not treating people when they get ill by admitting them into hospital, but keeping them healthy and out of hospital. COVID is all about that. And finally, making sure that if people are living healthier and longer lives, that they can be productive for longer. That is how we solve the economic cost of aging. Because if we are living longer and healthier for longer, we should be richer, not poorer. It should just be good news for the economy. But if I go right back to what I said at the beginning, the absolute key thing here is that we start a social narrative. We've got to make sure that as a society, we come together in the way we did with the Industrial Revolution and say, this is what we want and this is what we need. That's the agenda that we need to start, particularly post-COVID. Lynda, I know you've got another poll that we're going to try and bring in. Do you want to come in and do that?
Yes, so Andrew has talked about what he thinks we believe to be important, but let's have a look at what you think is important in terms of the institutional change that you think is crucial. And then we're going to go straight into questions because I can see the time is slipping by. We've already got a load of questions lined up. Please, Eric is sitting there waiting for more questions as well. So if you have any more questions, please fire them off to Eric now. And whilst you're doing that, because we know every alumni at London Business School can multitask, you can also take a look at what institutional changes, you can do more than one, do you think are most important? Corporations move to multiple points of entry, they restructure retirement, their education is reorientated to lifelong learning, it switches to stackable credentials so that you can stack your credentials as you go through your life. Government introduces universal basic income. Government restricts, as Andrew mentioned a moment ago, how technologies are introduced. Press your poll button now, and as you do so, use the other hand to write a couple of questions. Yes, lifelong learning. You can tell that this is a highly educated group. Not much, a little bit of support for universal basic income. 30% of you are up for that. No, very few of you want to restrict how governments introduce technology. A big yes to lifelong learning and multiple points of entry. Let me hand back now to Eric, who I know is going to be taking the questions. And we've got now 15 minutes for questions, so thank you so much. Eric.
Thank you very much for the presentation. We have a ton of questions and I'm afraid we're not going to get through everything. But a very brief question first off, maybe how has your thinking evolved since you published this one to come to this one? What sort of the surprises that you had and that you thought you needed to address again between the two books? Lynda has appetite, I see.
Yeah, well, I think both of us could answer that, Eric, but let me start off and then maybe Andrew might want to come in as well. Both of us are interested in the future of work. In fact, the future, I've written a number of earlier books about that, where I'd looked at a whole range of other trends that are shaping our world. But in the 100-Year Life, we wanted really to zoom in on one aspect of the future, which was what happens when everybody lives to 100. And to look at that through the lens of individuals. If you remember, we invented 3 personas that would help us think about how do you come to terms with that when you're a young person, when you're middle-aged, and when you're old. But as we thought more about that, we wanted to broaden our scope. And so the new long life is an opportunity to take us a much broader view of the future, to bring in the technological and social changes, but also I think really to position it, as Andrew was saying before, in terms of social ingenuity. We realize that human ingenuity has created these extraordinary technologies. They've helped us to live longer. But what we need now is social ingenuity, both in terms of how we live our own lives, but also how our institutions are more ingenious. Andrew, anything to add to that?
No, it's a great question, Eric. To be honest, I think, I don't think there's much about the 100-year life we'd want to recant. I think we've gone sort of deeper and understood some of the messages in that, and that comes through in this book more, particularly around, the notion that age is malleable, that sort of actually we think about things chronologically, but actually we can change how we age, either biologically, there's ways of doing that through exercise and what you eat, etc., but also sociologically. And I think the power of the 100-year life was about this positive approach around, hey, if life's longer, then surely that's a positive. And how do I seize that opportunity? And to me, one of the really rewarding things is how governments are beginning to buy into that and say, oh yeah, there is more old people, but actually how we're aging is changing. And then as Lynda says, just the intersection with technology was just very apparent, because if we are living these longer lives, how do we make ourselves future-proof against technology?
I have a couple of questions here about the monetary side, and really, is this sort of program achievable? Is it achievable with the current situation that governments are in, with sort of long extensive deficits? And also, is it advisable to move to a secure income or a universal benefit system to support this sort of transition, or will that just trigger selfish and potentially dysfunctional behavior?
Yeah, so I think, can we support this? Absolutely. It's not a question of payouts from the government. I would say if we don't change, then we have a big problem, because if everyone retires before 65 and they live in ill health, then we have a massive public finance problem. But that doesn't have to be the case. So this should be a way of bringing about self-financing change. Obviously, the agenda's become much, much harder. There's a German saying, I'm told, that everything tastes nicer with butter. And basically everything's easier with economic growth. And clearly COVID and the high level of public finances makes this more difficult. Take the aging society issue. I think the biggest impact for all of us perhaps here that COVID's had is not on our life expectancy, but on our finances. And so we'll be having to work for longer. But actually the labour market's going to be a tough place with high unemployment. So the urgency of this has become more important, but this should be self-financing. If we are living longer and healthier for longer, this is an investment. If we don't change, it's unsustainable, which is why we think we have to bring about a process of change. On the UBI one, let me just very quickly say, universal basic income, if everyone loses their job because of robots, then we've got universal basic income as any way to provide. I don't think redistribution is the key. I think the key to making sure we survive as an economy and a society is people having a meaningful job. And I think governments have to focus more upon achieving that than necessarily thinking about UBI. We've got to make sure that people are engaged in a purposeful form of activity. UBI could be a way to do that, but actually I think it again just thrusts the initiative onto the individual. We've got to make sure that people have two things. One is they feel they're gaining from the economic system. Two, they've got a voice in the political debate. Those two go together, then we'll succeed. If neither of them are there, then we have a problem.
I have maybe a question for Lynda here, and this question is about ageism, which you started to address during the talk, but it was also raised in the chat that we may have a double devil to beat, ageism and sexism. Is our social ingenuity far enough that we will accept larger numbers of, or will invite as corporates and as society larger numbers of aged people back into the workforce? And do we really have a double problem here, that we don't adequately support women throughout their career, and then obviously, what they've missed throughout their career already is sort of a double problem when they're passing, a certain age? That's probably for Lynda.
No, thank you for that question. And it's a crucial question. Andrew earlier talked about the statistics in terms of an aging population. One of the most interesting things, apart from teaching at London Business School, of course, that's happened to me over the last couple of years is Prime Minister Abe asked me to sit on his government council, because Japan, as you know, is the oldest population in the world, and also has the fewest women at senior levels, not actually at junior levels, but at senior levels. And so the government there were very keen to do something about that. And those of you from Japan know that I've been really quite involved in that, in helping think that through. And, you know, it seems to me, Eric, we have no choice. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous to turn our backs on people as they age. As Andrew said earlier, people are aging more healthily. Age is malleable. You know, people have said to Andrew and I, what did you do as a consequence of writing these books? I can tell you the first thing I did is I lost weight and exercised, because I'm, as some of you know, now in my mid-60s, and it was really important for me to stay healthy. So what did we come up with in Japan? Well, we said, you know, as you sort of hinted, Eric, if you want people to work right the way through their lives, you've got to have better childcare so that women can get back to work when they want to. And in Japan, as you know, that's very poor right now. So we talked about better childcare. We talked about lifelong learning, and we talked about governments upskilling and reskilling. So, I mean, there's much we can do. I mean, it could be that governments need to step in to look at ageism and the way they do it with gender. I would like governments to do that. I would like corporations to be held accountable for how many people they've got over the age of 60, just as they're held accountable for how many women they've got at senior positions. Because in my personal view, being both a woman and over the age of 60, I think ageism is worse than sexism. Now, that's my own personal experience. I think what people say about older people is even worse than what some of them say about women working. So we've got to do something about that. And I think that it starts really within the home. And that's why I said earlier, it's really important that governments support and corporations support paternity leave. So men are able to do more in the home. You know, I think I don't know how many of you out there are women on the program, but I know we've all read Lean In. So women have learned to lean in. I would say it's time also that men learn to step up. And I think when we do that, and we have families where the domestic caring roles are more evenly distributed, will therefore encourage both men and women to work. And then, you know, you get into a situation where you can move between partners in terms of how you live a longer life. One of the things I've said to Japanese men for a couple of years now is, you know, by not encouraging women to work, it means that you are the sole provider of a family where it's likely you're going to live to 100. That's a very frightening thought. And I think it's really important that we all distribute both the economic and the caring responsibilities across society, regardless of somebody's gender. So thank you, whomever it was, for that great question.
Can I throw in a question about you know, differences between regions? I mean, of course, we have, you know, wealthy but very aged societies like the US, like Europe, like Japan, and then of course we have other countries. I mean, let's think about, you know, South Africa or Egypt, or some countries like Brazil and so forth, also in emerging Asia, where the pyramid is quite different, and the starting level of available resources is also quite different. Do your ideas work differently, or does the stress fall in different parts of the equation? If you kind of step out of, you know, the wealthy societies but aged societies that we know. I might start with Andrew, I think, for this one.
Yeah, no, thank you. I often get that question, and I think what's interesting in the question is it shows a misunderstanding in general of aging, because we have this concept of young and old, and it's like they're two ethnic groups, but actually I've got a great secret to reveal to you: the young eventually become old. And what's interesting, you're quite right, they're at a different point in their sort of demographic. So what happens, there's two things happening. There's this demographic pyramid changing. As the birth rate declines, you have fewer young people, and you have more older people. And as you get richer, the birth rate falls. So many countries like South Africa are at an early stage in this demographic transition. They've still got a lot of young people. They haven't got many old. But what will happen to South Africa is in 20, 30, 40 years' time, that big cohort who are currently young will be old. So actually, if you think about it in terms of longevity, South Africa is really a great example. Nigeria would be another one. You've got to start when you're young, preparing for when you get old. If you're going to try and age positively, the earlier you start, the better. The good news is it's never too late. You know, whether you're in your 20s or your 80s, you can still prepare and make a difference the next decade. But you've got to start when you're young and healthy, because then you've got more opportunity to prepare. And then the other flip side of this is actually most older people over 65 live in low-income, middle-income countries. So although the higher proportion of population in rich countries is old, most people aged over 65 live in middle or low-income countries, and they are all aging. All of them are seeing, I mean, that's the interesting thing. We use the word aging to think about people being old, but the whole point about aging is it's happening every single year of our life. And that's the key insight.
Given that we're far advanced in our time, I would have like a final question for Lynda, and that's about the culture of long hours. I mean, how would you approach a situation where I guess some of our graduates are probably in that situation where you have an employer who maybe expects or maybe doesn't expect, but everybody else does it, where you have the culture of long hours. How would you attack that, saying, you know, these long hours are in the way because I cannot be a participating father. I push all of the work to my wife, or I can't really make up time for the lifelong learning that we've agreed we need.
Yeah. I think there's a couple of important sort of aspects embedded in that question, Eric. And I know that many of you out there will have times when you work very long hours. Let me address that in a number of ways. Firstly, you know, when you measure productivity, which is incredibly easy to measure in things like call centers and extremely difficult to measure in things like research scientists or investment bankers, then you use as a proxy the number of hours that people work. So in a way, those of you who are knowledge workers have used long hours as a proxy to productivity and creativity. The fact is that there isn't a great deal of relationship between long hours and productivity, but nevertheless, you can see how that's happened. The second thing is, I advise law firms in my private practice, and some of you might know I'm married to a lawyer who's an M&A lawyer, and he works unbelievably long hours. And his argument is, it's you know, if you're doing an M&A transaction, you have to be doing it all the time. And I sort of get that. So I think you also have to think about the task itself, and to say there are some tasks where you have to work very long hours to get the thing done in a very short period of time. In that case, you need to take time off, because what we find about hours and fatigue is it's not the hours per se, it's the fact that you don't have any time off. So, you know, I know McKinsey, for example, and maybe some of you who are out there from McKinsey will write to me and say, Lynda, you got this wrong. But certainly my friends at McKinsey's tell me that now when you do a big project like an M&A project, you have time off at the end to recuperate. So first of all, don't think that long hours makes you more productive, but secondly, some tasks seem to involve working long hours, in which case you need to take time off. But thirdly, it was really interesting to me that so many of you wanted flexible work. And I've been writing a great deal during the pandemic about this issue. Some of you know I'm a columnist with MIT Sloan. I've written a whole series of articles in MIT about that, and I've done 5 webinars about that. And what I think is that the pandemic has absolutely accelerated issues of flexible working. I don't think we're ever going to go back to working like we did. I don't believe, by the way, we're all going to work at home all the time, because that's got real problems associated with it as well. But actually, for someone like me who's been saying for years, we need more flexible ways of working, guess what? It is now arriving.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we have run out of time. We've had a great talk from 2 great professors, but also thought leaders here today. Once again, thank you, Lynda and Andrew.